In 1983, during a quiet Sunday Mass in rural Pennsylvania, an 8-year-old girl named Emily vanished from the pews of St. Clement's Church, never to be seen again. The congregation was left stunned, the investigation stalled, and her father, Thomas, haunted. But 4 decades later, a forgotten VHS tape is found during renovations, and with it, the chilling truth begins to resurface. The dust-covered recorder whirred to life. The afternoon sun cast golden streaks across the arched windows of St. Clement's Church, painting the polished pews and stone floor with soft hues. It was a warm Sunday in September 1983, and the church smelled faintly of candle wax and warm hymnals. The choir was mid-verse in a solemn rendition of "Be Thou My Vision," while the congregation stood in reverent silence. Among the rows of worshippers was Thomas Gray, a lanky man in his late 30s with thick black eyebrows and considerable effort at an attainable look that had only grown deeper since his wife left. He held his daughter's tiny hand as they sang, her voice thin but confident. Emily was 8, curious, intelligent, with a habit of twirling her hair when she was nervous, and a tiny scar on her left eyebrow from a fall off her bike last summer. She loved going to church with her father, mostly because of the stained glass and the gentle rise and fall of organ music, which she said sounded like a story being told without words. Halfway through the sermon, Emily tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, I have to go." Thomas nodded, whispered directions to the nearest restroom behind the side altar, and watched her scamper off, white shoes tapping lightly against the stone floor. He didn't know it then, but that would be the last time he would ever see her walk away. He continued listening to the sermon, occasionally glancing toward the hallway where she'd vanished. 10 minutes passed, then 15. He assumed the line for the restroom was long, or that she'd stopped to look at something. Emily always got distracted by little things. 20 minutes in, he stood. A quiet panic stirred beneath his rib. He walked down the side aisle toward the restroom, past the statue of St. Mary. The corridor was empty, the door to the girls' restroom slightly ajar. "Emily?" he called, tapping lightly. No answer. He stepped inside. The air smelled of lavender cleaner. One of the stalls was closed. He pushed it open. Empty. By the time he informed Father Doyle, the Mass was ending. Ushers were quietly alerted. The church was closed off. They searched the grounds, the confessionals, the vestry. Nothing. Thomas ran from room to room, calling her name until his voice cracked. The police were called an hour later. They arrived with clipboards and questions and cool professionalism that made Thomas ache. They asked when he last saw her, who she might have gone with. Was there anyone suspicious around? But nothing made sense. There were no signs of forced entry or exit. No screams. No broken windows. Her coat and coloring book were still at the pew. The security cameras installed in 1979 after an attempted break-in had not been operational for months. Budget cuts, Father Doyle had said apologetically. Thomas stared blankly at the dusty camera above the north exit. By nightfall, volunteers lit candles and formed search parties. Flashlights combed the streets, the cemetery, the playground behind the church. No one found anything, not a footprint, not a piece of clothing, not even her beret. She had simply vanished. The community rallied behind Thomas in the beginning. Posters with Emily's photo, her toothy smile and bright eyes, went up around the town. People brought food. The local news ran segments for weeks. But as time passed and no answers came, the whispers started. Was she taken? Did she run? Did her father know more than he was saying? The police questioned him again and again. His answers never changed, but suspicion crept in like mold. Emily's mother, already estranged, moved away, unable to cope. Thomas stayed. He returned to the church every Sunday, sitting in the same pew. He refused to believe she was dead. He believed in something else. Maybe she had been taken. Maybe she was being hidden. Maybe she would come back. He believed that until belief itself became a ritual, like prayer. Over time, St. Clement's moved on. New families, new faces. A few parishioners remembered Emily, how polite she was, how she liked to sing along even when she didn't know the words. But most people forgot. Except Thomas. He waited. Year after year, he never missed a service. And in his home, her bedroom stayed untouched. Bed made, books neatly stacked, a calendar still turned to September 1983. The first 72 hours were a blur of sirens, search dogs, phone calls, and Thomas sitting in an interrogation room under harsh fluorescent lights. Officers paced behind two-way mirrors while he repeated the same timeline over and over. Emily asked to go to the restroom. He let her go. She didn't come back. Every word felt like another stone added to the weight already crushing his chest. Detectives swarmed St. Clement's Church, mapping every corner, testing fingerprints on doorknobs, analyzing footprints in the dust. But nothing pointed to what had happened. The restroom was clean, no trace of struggle, no hairs, no skin cells, nothing out of place. They canvassed the surrounding neighborhood, door-to-door visits, dozens of interviews, and yet no one saw a little girl leave the church that day. Not on foot, not in a car, not carried in someone's arms. No traffic cams caught anything. The town square cameras, still analog, were pointed in the wrong direction. The case wasn't just cold, it was vanishing like mist. By the end of the first week, suspicion began to drift toward the church staff, particularly toward Leo Martin, a young custodian who'd been working there for 2 years. Quiet, thin, with an awkward smile and a habit of avoiding eye contact, Leo made an easy target. Someone recalled seeing him near the restrooms just before Emily disappeared. Rumors flared. He was called in for questioning. Police searched his apartment, his car, his locker in the church basement. They found nothing, no photos, no articles of clothing, no signs of abduction. His alibi was frustratingly solid. He'd left halfway through Mass to help a parishioner with a flat tire a few blocks away. That parishioner confirmed the story. Even the time-stamped receipt from a nearby gas station placed Leo far from the scene at the critical time. With no physical evidence, the accusations collapsed, but the damage to Leo's reputation didn't. He resigned 2 weeks later and left town under a cloud of whispers. Meanwhile, Thomas was unraveling. He hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night since the day Emily disappeared. His hands trembled when he tried to eat. He couldn't work, couldn't think. All he could do was walk the town endlessly, posting flyers, begging store owners to display her face, hoping a child's smile would stir someone's memory. But the silence stretched on. Tips came in, dozens of them. People claimed to have seen a girl like Emily in grocery stores, gas stations, playgrounds, even on the side of a rural highway. Each time, Thomas followed up. Each time, it wasn't her. 3 weeks after the disappearance, the case took a darker turn. An anonymous tip suggested the police look closer at Thomas himself. At first, it seemed absurd. He was the grieving father, not a suspect. But then they discovered the family had been under stress. Thomas and his wife, Mary Ann, had separated 6 months before. Their arguments over parenting were known to a few close friends. One neighbor recalled hearing a heated fight just 3 days before Emily vanished, something about custody, discipline, and letting her go wild. Another said Thomas had once yelled that maybe she'd be better off without all the interference. Innocent words, twisted by grief and fear, began to sound menacing. Investigators dug into Thomas's past. He had no criminal record, no history of violence. But they noticed he was emotionally detached during the initial interviews. He didn't cry. He didn't break down. He seemed focused, cold, controlled. A detective theorized that perhaps guilt showed itself differently. Maybe he regretted something. Thomas felt it. The shift, the way officers started watching him instead of listening. He knew the look in their eyes. It was the same as the one he saw in town, on people's faces when he passed. He became the center of a quiet storm. Parents pulled their children closer when he walked by. Friends stopped returning his calls. Even Mary Ann stopped answering. She had moved to Denver weeks earlier. They hadn't spoken since the funeral they never had. The police invited Thomas back for more interviews, hours-long sessions in cold rooms with ticking clocks. They questioned inconsistencies that weren't there, created gaps in timelines that had no gaps. They asked if he'd ever blacked out, if he drank, if he had any resentment toward his daughter, if he felt alone. One officer asked point blank, "Is it possible you lost control that day?" Thomas stared at him, hollow-eyed. "You think I hurt my child?" The officer didn't answer. He just waited. A polygraph was suggested. Thomas refused. Not out of guilt, he said, but because he no longer trusted the people asking the questions. His lawyer intervened. The interviews stopped. But the stigma remained. Though never officially charged, Thomas was now the implied villain in a story no one could understand. He became a ghost in his own town. He sold his car to pay private investigators. He rented motel rooms across state lines to follow weak leads. He grew thinner. His beard, once neatly trimmed, became scraggly and gray. At St. Clement's, people shifted when he entered. They prayed with more silence when he sat down. Father Doyle offered sympathy, but nothing more. "We must trust in God's plan," he said. Thomas didn't respond. Months passed, seasons changed. Emily's bedroom remained untouched. The flyers faded, the edges curled. Newspapers moved on. The town moved on. Only Thomas remained fixed, like a stone too heavy for time to move. And somewhere beneath the burden of grief and suspicion, he began to wonder. What if the answer was never outside the church? What if he had missed something in that corridor, or someone? The first anniversary of Emily's disappearance arrived with a cruel precision, as if the calendar itself had been waiting to twist the knife just a little deeper. By then, the house had become a silent shrine, its walls holding the echoes of a child's laughter that hadn't graced the rooms in over 12 months. The nursery door remained closed, not out of denial, but in a desperate attempt to preserve something, anything, that hadn't yet slipped away. Thomas had stopped speaking to most people. Conversations exhausted him. Sympathy stung worse than silence. But every Sunday, without fail, he returned to St. Clement's, sitting in the exact same pew where he last held his daughter's hand. He stared at the same altar, sang the same hymns, and watched the shadows dance across the stained glass windows in the same rhythm Emily had once admired. His wife, Mary Ann, no longer joined him. The strain had been growing like mold in the corners of their marriage, quiet and invasive. In the beginning, they held hands tightly, desperate for answers, attending press conferences together, handing out flyers, comforting each other with promises they didn't quite believe. But as the weeks turned into months and the phone never rang, those shared moments became fewer. Mary Ann began sleeping in the guest room. Her voice grew distant. She stopped crying in front of him. She stopped asking questions. She started locking the bathroom door. One night she came home smelling of wine and unfamiliar perfume. The next morning, she didn't deny it. She just stared at him with eyes emptied out by grief and fatigue and said, "I need to breathe, Tom. I need to live again, somehow." He didn't argue. He didn't have the strength. She moved out 2 weeks later. She left behind her wedding ring on the dresser and a letter that began with, "I'm sorry," and ended with, "Please don't hate me." Thomas didn't hate her. He barely felt anything anymore. After she left, he stopped referring to the house as ours and began calling it the place. He cooked less, drank more coffee, stopped watching the news. At work, he was given indefinite leave. His co-workers didn't ask questions. People understood, or at least pretended to. But behind his back, the whispers never stopped. There were rumors that Mary Ann had started over in another state, perhaps even remarried. Thomas never checked. He didn't want to know. He just stayed quiet, unmoved, unchanging. What kept him returning to St. Clement's every week wasn't just habit, it was obligation. He believed, deep down, that the church still held the answer, that something about that day was out of place. He had replayed it in his mind thousands of times, the hymn, the sermon, the exact moment Emily let go of his hand, the sound of her footsteps fading down the aisle. Something didn't fit. Something remained off, and no one had seen it, or if they had, they hadn't spoken. Then, one Sunday in late autumn, a woman named Linda Holcomb approached him in the parking lot. She had been a church volunteer for over 20 years, mostly helping with food drives and organizing pews between services. Elderly, with white hair pinned back neatly and soft hands that shook just slightly when she talked, Linda hesitated as she stepped into his path. "Mr. Gray," she began gently, "I've debated whether to bring this up. I should have a long time ago, but—" She looked down, embarrassed. "It didn't seem right to stir things up back then, and I wasn't even sure what I saw." Thomas stood still, the October wind pressing against his coat. He didn't respond, just waited. Linda continued, choosing her words carefully. "Sunday, when Emily went missing, I was stationed near the East Wing doors during the service. You remember the crowd, the commotion. But before all that, about 20 minutes into the Mass, I noticed a woman I didn't recognize. Older, heavy-set, wearing a navy shawl. She wasn't part of the regular congregation. I thought she might be someone's visiting aunt. She hesitated again. She was holding a child's hand, a small girl, maybe 7 or 8, and the girl had curly hair, light brown. She looked like Emily. Thomas's breath caught. The world seemed to narrow. Linda noticed and raised a hand. "I told myself it wasn't her, that Emily was with you, that I must have been mistaken. I never saw them leave. And when everything happened later, I didn't want to make things worse. But I can still see it in my mind, that little hand." Her voice trembled now. "And I can't help but think I should have said something back then." Thomas's mind reeled. Why hadn't this been mentioned in the investigation? Why hadn't the police interviewed her about it? He asked her that exact question, his voice steadier than he expected. Linda looked ashamed. "They never asked me directly. I was in the kitchen most of that day. I thought someone else would have seen her. I didn't think anyone would take me seriously." She handed him a small notepad. "I tried sketching her face once, that woman. I don't know if it helps, but I couldn't throw it away." Thomas took the paper. The drawing was crude, but something about the profile, the posture, ignited a flicker in his memory. A shawl. He had seen a similar silhouette in one of the old service photos, group shots taken after each Mass, pinned on the bulletin board in the vestibule. He thanked Linda, his voice hoarse, then walked back into the empty church. He stared at the stained glass again, but this time he wasn't just looking for God. He was looking for a ghost, for the figure that may have led his daughter away, not with force, but with familiarity. And if someone saw her, maybe someone else remembered, maybe someone else had forgotten to speak. Or had been too scared, or had their reasons. The church basement smelled of dust and aging paper, the kind of scent that clung to the brick and wood like a secret held too long. The space was dimly lit, the lone bulb overhead flickering sporadically, as if hesitant to expose what had been left forgotten for decades. It was April 2023, and St. Clement's had finally approved renovations to modernize the old building, wiring, insulation, and structural reinforcements that had been deferred for years. One of the contractors, a young man named Derek, had been assigned to clean out the back room, known jokingly among staff as the cave. It was where old church records, decorations, and unused AV equipment were stashed away and seldom touched. While sifting through stacks of outdated hymnals and boxes marked Easter 1997, he unearthed a bulky gray VHS player, partially covered by a disintegrating choir robe. Curiosity piqued, he tugged it out from behind a metal filing cabinet, knocking loose a cloud of grime and cobwebs. Sitting just behind it was a small steel safe embedded into the brick wall, its keypad blinking a faded red. Word quickly spread among the staff, who gathered to marvel at the relics. Derek joked about hidden treasures or forgotten wills, but one of the older members of the church board, Agnes Marshall, went pale at the sight. "That's where we used to store the service recordings," she murmured, almost to herself. Father Doyle insisted on taping every Sunday in the early 80s for archival purposes. The room fell silent for a beat. Someone mentioned 1983. Someone else whispered, "Emily." But the moment passed, swallowed by uncertainty. Thomas heard about the discovery the following Sunday. He'd arrived, as always, before the bells rang. Though his face had grown older and thinner, his routine had not changed. Third pew from the front, left side, hands folded, eyes scanning the floor as if the answers might still be hidden in the marble veins. When Agnes approached him after the service and mentioned the VHS player and the locked safe, something shifted behind his tired gaze. "Do you know what was inside it?" he asked, his voice low. Agnes shook her head. "No one remembers the code. Father Doyle passed years ago. We think it's just dust and tape." But Thomas knew better. His mind lit up like a hallway where lights flicker back on, one by one. Before he became a full-time office clerk, he had worked part-time repairing electronics, mostly cameras and recorders, for a local shop. He'd dismantled VCRs on malfunctioning camcorders and rewired countless security feeds in the late 70s and early 80s, back when video was recorded in analog and every machine had a unique sound, a whir, a click, the soft buzz of a tape rewinding. His fingers remembered those machines better than they remembered the warmth of holding hands, so when he asked to see the safe, no one objected. In the old room, now stripped of most of its clutter, Thomas knelt before the small wall model safe. The keypad was outdated but familiar. He examined the casing, the wiring beneath, the faded stickers. Then he reached for a screwdriver in the janitor's kit and began disassembling the front panel, not to break in, but to trigger the backup overall system he knew these older models used. Most churches, due to liability concerns, had the manufacturer install a second failsafe code that defaulted to a basic string, a church-specific pattern, or a date. He tried the date of St. Clement's founding. Nothing. Then he paused, breathing slowly. He entered 92,583, the date Emily vanished. Inside there were 8 VHS tapes, labeled in handwritten marker by date. Most were faded. One stood out, Sept 25, 1983, main nave, 3 p.m. service. Thomas's heart stopped. He stared at the label for a long time before reaching for it, his hand trembling. The church hadn't had a working VHS player in years, but Thomas remembered the one in his attic. He had kept it, like he kept everything tied to Emily. A box of her drawings, a worn-out bear, the bedtime story cassette she used to listen to. That night, he sat alone in his dim living room, blinds closed, rain tapping softly against the windows. The player sputtered to life, its mechanical gears groaning like old bones. He fed the tape in and pressed play. The screen buzzed, lines flickering across the television before the image steadied. There it was, the church nave in grainy analog black and white, a static wide shot of the altar and pews just like he remembered. At first, nothing seemed unusual. People entering, shaking hands, choir assembling. Then, around timestamp 0:17 and 49 seconds, Thomas leaned forward. The camera had a limited view, fixed from the side balcony, but it caught enough. Emily could be seen walking down the side aisle, her ponytail bouncing gently, white dress slightly oversized. Then, about 4 seconds later, a figure entered frame, partially obscured by a column. Short, broad, wearing what looked like a shawl. The figure turned toward the hallway leading to the restrooms. Then, they were both gone. Thomas paused the tape, rewound, played again, slower, frame by frame. He leaned in until his forehead nearly touched the screen. The woman's face never turned fully to the camera, but the posture, the movement, it triggered something. A memory. Not clear, but enough to stir a sickening chill deep in his gut. He let the tape run until the end. Nothing more appeared, just the rest of the service, the recessional. The lights dimming, the congregation leaving. No one noticed Emily hadn't come back. Not then. Not until it was far, far too late. Thomas sat back, staring at the now black screen. His hands rested on his knees. For the first time in years, he didn't feel hopeless. He felt direction. Not closure, not peace, but motion. And in that moment, a realization crystallized. Someone else had been in that hallway, someone never identified. And the church had captured it all. The following morning, Thomas didn't go to work, didn't call anyone, didn't eat breakfast. He sat at the kitchen table with the VHS tape still in his coat pocket, his knuckles white from clutching it all night. The image of Emily on that screen, so alive, so unaware, played on a loop in his mind. But it wasn't just her. It was the figure that emerged seconds after her, shadowy, deliberate, and unmistakably adult. He needed a clearer view. He needed a second opinion. So he called the only person he knew who still had equipment capable of digitizing old tapes. Mike Sandoval, a local history teacher and AV enthusiast who'd turned his garage into a museum of defunct media. Mike welcomed Thomas in without hesitation. They'd known each other casually through church years ago, and although they hadn't spoken much since Emily's disappearance, the gravity in Thomas's voice had been enough. Mike placed the tape into a more sophisticated deck, this one with stabilization features and digital enhancement software. The footage flickered to life again on a newer Quisper monitor. Thomas leaned forward, his breath shallow as the timestamp approached the same moment, 0:17 and 49 seconds. There she was, Emily. Then, just like before, the second figure. Mike paused and zoomed, enhancing the contrast. They couldn't see the face, but the posture, the cut of the jacket, the short combed-over hair, and the slight limp, those were all clues. Mike tilted his head. "This looks like someone I've seen before," he said slowly. Thomas turned to him, the words catching in his throat. "Who?" Mike typed something on his tablet, pulling up old church directories which he had scanned and archived for historical projects. He navigated to the staff listing from 1983. Rows of portraits appeared: ushers, choir members, clergy, and finally, administrative staff. Thomas stared at the screen until his eyes locked on a name and a face that hadn't crossed his mind in decades. Richard Alvin Norwood, Finance and Operations Manager. It hit him like a punch to the chest. Richard. A quiet, reserved man in his late 50s back then, always present during church fundraisers, always overseeing donation boxes and ledgers with a clinical precision. He wasn't exactly warm, but he was polite. Neither liked nor disliked Carol. Thomas remembered how Richard always sat near the back, rarely interacted with children, and left quickly after services. More importantly, he remembered how Richard had abruptly retired less than a month after Emily's disappearances. No ceremony, no farewell. Just gone. At the time, with everything that was happening, no one questioned it. It had been swallowed by the chaos. Now, it stood out like a red flag. Thomas asked Mike to print a still from the enhanced footage. The figure in the hallway wasn't crystal clear, but the body language, the stance, the peculiar limp, it all pointed in one direction. Richard Norwood. Back home, Thomas dug through the boxes of news clippings and church programs he had collected over the years. He found an old financial report from 1982, signed by Richard. Then, at the bottom of a stack, he found a faded newsletter from late October 1983. Mr. R. Norwood has decided to take early retirement to focus on his health, it read. No photo, no contact information, just a line of text and a closing blessing. That was it. No follow-up articles, no mention in later records. Thomas took the photo and the tape still to the local police department. He met with Detective Lou Penna, a younger investigator who had joined the department long after the original case went cold. Thomas listened carefully, reviewed the footage, and scanned the printout with growing concern. "We've never seen this," he said honestly. "It was never in evidence," Thomas nodded, "because it was locked away in a forgotten safe for 40 years. Penna agreed to reopen the case file and launch a background search on Norwood. That same afternoon, Thomas sat in his car outside the church, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his fingers went numb. The storm that had been dormant for decades was beginning to move again. Within days, Penna's team uncovered new details. Norwood had left the state after his early retirement and relocated to a remote area in Maine under a different mailing address. There had been no criminal record, no known family, and no social connections. He had lived off a modest pension, filing taxes intermittently. His home was paid in cash. Most peculiar of all, they discovered that his name had never appeared in any of the volunteer rosters, community events, or public directories again after 1983. It was as if he'd wanted to be forgotten. Thomas insisted on joining Detective Penna on the trip to Maine. He had to look the man in the eye. He had to ask what happened to his daughter. The detective agreed, but warned him to let law enforcement handle the approach. They flew out on a Thursday, arriving in a quiet coastal town where Norwood's last known address sat along a wooded lane, half concealed by pine trees and salt-warm fences. As the patrol car pulled up, Thomas's heart pounded. A part of him feared they were too late, that Norwood had died in obscurity, taking the truth with him. But the mailbox still bore the name R.A. Norwood, and through the front window they saw movement. Penna stepped out first, badge in hand, and knocked firmly. The door creaked open. An old man stood behind it, hunched, pale, his eyes watery but alert. "Mr. Norwood?" Penna asked. The man didn't answer. He looked past the detective, straight at Thomas, who had stepped onto the porch behind him. Their eyes met, and something shifted in Norwood's expression. Recognition, fear, or maybe just memory. Thomas stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember Emily?" Norwood blinked once. His lips parted, but before he could speak, his knees gave out. He collapsed onto the floor. Penna rushed inside, calling for paramedics. Thomas stood frozen, fists clenched, watching the man who might hold the key to everything slip into unconsciousness before a single word was said. At the hospital in Maine, Richard Norwood lay unconscious for nearly 2 days. A stroke, the doctors said, perhaps brought on by stress or age. His condition was stable but fragile, and communication was uncertain. While he remained in a hospital bed surrounded by beeping monitors and the sterile scent of disinfectant, Detective Lou Pena began assembling a new task force dedicated to reopening the Gray case, now officially reclassified from inactive to active due to the newly surfaced VHS evidence. The footage Thomas had uncovered as Exhibit A in what was being labeled a potential objection with extended concealment. For the first time in 4 decades, the name Emily Gray returned to the whiteboards and discussion rooms of the precinct, not as a cold case curiosity, but as a file alive with new leads and urgency. Thomas watched silently from across the room as detectives pulled old boxes from the archives, dusty, water-stained, filled with brittle folders and faded photographs. He saw his own handwriting on some of the early witness reports, his younger self staring back in Polaroid stills from community searches, frozen in time alongside a missing poster that had never truly faded from his memory. Detective Pena assigned 2 junior officers to comb through hospital records across the Tri-Comrie area, focusing on September and October of 1983. It was a long shot, especially given that many records from that period had not yet been digitized, but hope often hid in overlooked corners. While others looked into Norwood's bank activity, aliases, and any connections he might have had to child welfare institutions, one particular lead emerged from an unlikely place: a handwritten admission log recovered from the now-defunct Mercy Ridge Hospital in Dover, a small facility that closed its doors in 1992 and had long since been converted into a storage complex. The paper was yellowed and brittle, but the ink was legible. Date: September 26, 1983. Patient: Emily G., age approximately 5'8". Character note: possible memory impairment. Guardian listed: Richard A., Norwood, relation, uncle. Reason for visit: requires observation. A rush of electricity shot through the room when the document was placed on the table. Thomas stood still as Pena read it aloud, his voice tight but controlled. The spelling, Emily with 2 S, was close enough to be a deliberate obfuscation, but the age, date, and guardian match were too precise to ignore. No follow-up records under that name were found in the same facility. The child had disappeared from the system after that single visit. Thomas gripped the back of his chair, his knuckles white, as Pena issued the order to cross-reference social services databases under similar names, with variations of Emily, Gray, G, and Norwood. The paper trail was thin, but technology was now in their favor. Over the next 48 hours, they filtered through thousands of entries, narrowing the search to cases of children placed in informal guardianship arrangements in New England between 1983 and 1985. The breakthrough came from a 1984 school registration form in Bangor, Maine, where a young girl named Sarah Green, previously known as Emily Green, had been enrolled at the age of 9, having relocated from New York under the guardianship of an older man identified as her great-uncle, Richard Norwood. Sarah had no birth certificate on file, only an affidavit signed by Norwood and stamped by a rural notary in Penobscot County. Her medical file indicated a prior head injury with no further details and occasional memory lapses. She stayed at that school for 2 years, then abruptly transferred to another district. The trail fragmented after that, with occasional mentions in church rosters, summer camp applications, and one public library card issued in 1989. But now they had something solid: a name, a school, a location. And more importantly, the possibility that Emily Gray had not died, had not been lost forever, but had been living under another name, another life, unaware of who she really was. Thomas could hardly process the weight of that revelation. For so long he had accepted the possibility that Emily was gone. For years he had existed in limbo, floating between faith and despair, never fully letting go but unable to move forward. Now, with this one fragile document, this one ghost of a paper trail, he had reason to believe his daughter might still be alive. But he also knew that trauma, especially in children, rewrote memory like waves reshaping sand. If she'd suffered a serious head injury, her recollection of the events, or of him, could be fragmented, buried, or worse, rewritten by the person who had taken her in. Pamus assigned 2 investigators to visit the Bangor neighborhood where Sarah Green had once lived, hoping to locate records, neighbors, or photos. Meanwhile, Thomas stared for hours at the Mercy Ridge log, fingers tracing the name like it was a scripture. In the depths of his heart, something long dormant stirred, a dangerous, trembling hope. Back in Maine, Richard Norwood awoke from his stroke. His eyes fluttered open slowly, adjusting to the sterile ceiling above, and within minutes he realized he was not alone. A uniformed officer sat beside him, silent but watchful. A nurse entered, gently checking his visitor soon, law enforcement with questions about a girl he may have taken 4 decades ago. Richard said nothing. His breathing slowed, his gaze unfocused, as if retreating inward. But when he was left alone, he reached shakily for the bedside drawer, pulled out an old leather-bound notebook, and laid it on his lap. Inside were fragments, receipts, clippings, and a single photograph of a girl with curls and a gap-toothed smile, labeled in faded pen. Outside the room, Thomas waited. His hands were steady, his eyes sharp. For the first time in 40 years, he was no longer just a man sitting in a pew. When investigators finally obtained access to the now sealed medical records and social services documents surrounding the child listed as Emily G., the pattern of manipulation began to reveal itself with chilling clarity. Richard Norwood had filled out the admission paperwork at Mercy Ridge Hospital, identifying himself as the child's legal guardian and claiming that she had suffered a fall while hiking on private land they frequented during nature weekends. The notes taken by the attending physician documented visible head trauma consistent with a blunt impact to the right parietal lobe, leading to symptoms of disorientation and retrograde amnesia. When the hospital followed protocol by contacting local authorities and attempting to verify parental rights, Norwood had already prepared his explanation. Emily had been in his care for 6 months following the death of her biological parents in a car accident, and though he had not finalized adoption paperwork, he had been acting in loco parentis to assume responsibility, at the time lacking centralized digital verification systems and constrained by rural resource limitations. The hospital staff filed the report, flagged the case as a potential ward of the state, and referred it to Child Protective Services. However, by the time the caseworker arrived 5 days later, Norwood had already filed emergency guardianship through a notary public in a neighboring county, exploiting a loophole in Maine's guardianship law that permitted temporary custody under urgent and compassionate circumstances. The investigation revealed that the official inquiry into Emily's identity had been suspended after 3 weeks, when no one responded to a limited call for familial verification posted in 2 regional papers. Norwood claimed that the girl did not remember her surname, home address, or immediate family, and that she referred to herself only as Emmy. With no active missing person match linked to her alias and no national coordination system like Amber Alert in place at the time, Amy Lee's case slipped between bureaucratic cracks. She was assigned a new Social Security number in 1984 under the name Sarah Emily Green, and her records were updated to reflect a birth date shifted by 3 months to obscure her trail further. A new life had been built on layers of soft lies and official indifference. By the time investigators in 2023 traced her to a current address, she had become a 48-year-old woman living under the name Sarah Green Bishop in Vermont, married, with 1 teenage son and a career as a high school librarian. She had no known criminal record, no travel outside the U.S., and no recollection of her life before the age of 9. Her earliest memories, as she later described in interviews, were fuzzy, like dreams someone told me were real. She remembered waking up in a hospital with bandages around her head and a soft-spoken man beside her who said he was her uncle. She remembered books, quiet, frequent moves, no family visits, no school photos from early grades, just long afternoons with puzzles and walks in the woods, and a perpetual sense that something about her childhood didn't quite fit. Detective Pena and a forensic psychologist specializing in trauma-induced amnesia prepared for their approach with care. This wasn't just a missing person inquiry anymore, it was the unraveling of an entire identity. When they visited her home and introduced themselves, Sarah invited them in with cautious politeness, her husband Matthew observing quietly from the doorway. The moment they mentioned the name Emily Gray, Sarah's expression faltered. She didn't recognize it, or rather, She didn't believe she did, but when they presented the hospital records, the early school photos, and finally, a blown-up version of the VHS, still showing the little girl walking into the church hallway, her hand went involuntarily to her temple. "That's me," she whispered, then quickly shook her head, as if denying the recognition even as it bloomed. "That looks like me, but I don't know that dress. I don't remember church." The psychologist asked gentle questions about her earliest memories, her hospital stay, the name Norwood, the transition to a new home. Bit by bit, the fragments surfaced. A woman singing softly in a pew, a hallway that smelled like lemon wax, a flash of light followed by darkness, a birthday cake with only one candle, and a man saying, "You've already had one this year, but we'll start fresh." DNA testing was expedited, comparing Sarah's sample with the preserved hair from Emily's baby book that Thomas had never thrown away. The results were conclusive, a 99.998% match. Emily Gray was alive. She had been living for decades as Sarah Green Bishop, unaware of her true name, true parents, or the life that had been stolen from her one Sunday afternoon in 1983. When the results were shared, Sarah sat quietly on her porch for over an hour, not speaking, not crying, just staring out at the garden she had planted with her son the previous spring. Her husband sat beside her, holding her hand. She asked to speak with Thomas. The reunion, arranged under careful supervision, took place in a neutral setting, a private room at the local community center. Thomas arrived early, carrying nothing but a small photo album and the worn flyer from 1983 that had never left his wallet. When Sarah walked in, they both paused, uncertain of what to say. It wasn't a cinematic embrace. It wasn't loud or weepy. It was quiet, brittle, and profound. Thomas opened the album to a picture of her as a toddler, held by a younger version of himself and Mary Ann, both smiling with sunburnt cheeks at a lake. Sarah stared at it for a long time. Then she reached out and touched the page. "I know that lake," she said softly. "I've dreamed about it for years." In the weeks that followed their initial meeting, Sarah remained distant. She was polite but guarded, overwhelmed by the weight of what she had been told and unsure whether to accept or reject it. Her husband, Matthew, supported her but remained skeptical, questioning the impact this emotional bombshell might have on their son and their carefully built life. Sarah, now nearing 50, had spent her entire adult life believing she was Sarah Green, raised in Maine, educated in Vermont, married in her early 30s, and a librarian for over 2 decades. She had friends, habits, routines, and an identity rooted in a story that, while incomplete, had been hers for as long as she could remember. Accepting that it might all have been fabricated felt like tearing the foundation out from under her feet. She couldn't see herself as Emily Gray, daughter of a man she didn't recall, lost from a life she couldn't picture. She had looked at the pictures Thomas showed her with a strange sense of detachment, like studying someone else's family album, familiar yet foreign. Thomas understood her hesitation. He had expected it, but he also felt something in her eyes, flickers of recognition she didn't want to acknowledge. He knew she had buried something. Maybe she didn't remember the church or her mother's voice or the nursery with the owl wallpaper, but deep inside he believed a part of her still carried the truth. That belief kept him from giving up when, 2 weeks later, the DNA results returned. Negative. The lab report stated with confidence that Sarah Green Bishop was not biologically related to Thomas Gray. The conclusion struck him like a slap. Payne called to offer condolences, urging him to prepare emotionally for the possibility that this wasn't her. But Thomas refused, not out of denial, but because something didn't fit. Too many details aligned: the hospital admission, the VHS image, the guardianship records, the matching timelines. It wasn't just coincidence. He had spent 40 years in doubt, but this time his instinct rang louder than any data. He requested the raw test files. At first, the lab denied the request, citing protocol, but Pena intervened, using the reopened investigation status to pressure the lab supervisor into compliance. Thomas reviewed every page of the documentation, consulting with an independent geneticist from a university lab in Boston. Together, they analyzed chain of custody logs, sample tracking, and barcode scans. That's when they found it. A clerical error in the entry log, 2 test tubes swapped due to a label printed incorrectly by a temp technician on the day Sarah's and another subject's samples were received. It was subtle, buried in layers of forms, but clear once isolated. The barcode on Sarah's file corresponded to a male patient from a separate case. Her sample had been mislabeled, and the test conducted with the wrong DNA. The lab confirmed the error. A second test was immediately ordered, this time overseen directly by the Boston geneticist. The waiting period felt unbearable. Thomas stopped sleeping again. He walked laps around his house. He revisited old photos and recordings. He played the VHS tape so many times he could recite the timestamp changes in sync with the images. Then, on a foggy Monday morning, the call came. This time the result was definitive. The DNA match confirmed with 99.998% certainty that Sarah Green, Bishop, was in fact Emily Gray. The mistake had nearly derailed everything. The lab issued a formal apology. The technician was suspended pending review. Penna informed Thomas first, then contacted Sarah. When Sarah heard the corrected result, she didn't speak at first. She simply sat on her porch, staring at her hands, unsure what to feel. Her identity, something she had clung to tightly in the face of rising doubt, was now fractured. The woman she believed she was had been built on a lie, and the man who had raised her, Richard Norwood, was now not just a guardian, but a captor in the eyes of the law. She struggled with guilt, with anger, with an aching confusion she couldn't articulate. That night, she opened the photo album Thomas had left with her. She studied the images again, the lake, the playroom, the drawing of an elephant labeled Emmy's Zoo. A flash crossed her mind. She remembered holding a crayon. She remembered the texture of the paper. Her hand shook. The following day she called Thomas. "I want to meet again," she said. "Somewhere quiet, just us." They met at a small lakeside park outside Brattleboro, Vermont. The fog rolled in low and soft, the kind of weather that made the water seem endless. Sarah walked up slowly, wearing a pale scarf and carrying a manila folder. She handed it to him without a word. Inside were drawings, some recent, some old. At the bottom of the stack was one of an owl, shaky but deliberate. "I don't remember drawing this," she said, "but I know it's mine." Thomas stared at it, the memory crashing into him like a wave. "You had that wallpaper. In your room." She nodded. "I think I remember pictures from it. It's like trying to read through fog, but something is there." He sat down on the bench, unable to speak. She sat beside him. For the next hour, they talked about her life, her childhood, her family, his years of searching. He told her about the Christmases he spent alone, lighting a candle in the church in her name. She told him about the birthdays Richard celebrated with strange rules, the trips they took where no photos were allowed, the words she was told never to speak. She cried, but quietly. So did he. And in that fragile silence, a bridge formed, not complete, not stable, but real. For the first time in decades, Thomas didn't feel like he was holding a memory. He was holding a presence. His daughter was beside him. In the days following the second DNA confirmation, Sarah withdrew from nearly everyone. The knowledge that she was not who she believed herself to be did not arrive as clarity. It arrived as a storm. Her mind, once comfortably settled into the neat chronology of Sarah Green's life, now cracked beneath the weight of a parallel existence demanding recognition. The name Emily Gray didn't yet feel like her own, but it clung to her in the spaces between sleep and waking, surfacing in dreams that left her breathless and disoriented. She dreamt of stained glass windows casting warm colors across polished wood, of a stuffed elephant named Mellow, of hands pulling her gently down a corridor, of voices calling her name. But it was always muffled, as though behind a thick pane of glass. Each morning she woke with tears drying on her cheeks and a tightening in her chest she couldn't explain. Her husband Matthew tried to be supportive, but he didn't know how to comfort someone discovering their identity had been hijacked before she was old enough to fight back. Their son Evan asked questions she couldn't answer. "Are you still my mom?" he once asked, his voice trembling. She hugged him tightly, whispering, "Always," even as she wondered what part of her was left to hold on to. At night, she began recording voice memos, capturing fragments of memory or emotion as they surfaced. Random thoughts like, "The pews smelled like lemon oil," or "A woman with red lipstick and a white scarf." She didn't know if these were real or imagined, but she needed to preserve them, like catching falling leaves before the wind carried them away. Thomas remained patient. He didn't push her for more meetings or answers. He simply left her space, occasionally mailing small packages to her address, an old drawing, a photo, a birthday card he had written but never sent. He knew healing wouldn't be linear, and reunion didn't resolution. But each time Sarah opened one of his envelopes, she felt something stir. One day, tucked inside a letter, she found a cassette tape. On it, in faded ink, was written, "Emily, Bedtime Songs." She played it that evening, alone in her room, and when the lullaby began, her knees gave out beneath her. She sat on the floor, sobbing, the melody unlocking a door she hadn't known existed. She saw herself tucked under a quilt, her mother brushing her hair, her father humming along, and the warm security of childhood flooded back, not fully, not coherently, but enough to make her heart ache. The trauma, however, had left deeper wounds. The psychologist working with Sarah identified symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress, exacerbated by memory loss and the sudden shift in identity. The name Richard Norwood had meant little to her before, but now, with context, his quiet, manipulative presence in her early years took on a sinister hue. He had not abused her physically, but his control had been absolute. He dictated what she could read, where she could go, and what parts of her past she was allowed to question. When she asked about her parents as a child, he said, "You were too young to remember them," and she believed him. When she questioned why she had no baby pictures, he told her they were lost in a fire. Over time, the absences in her story became normal. She stopped asking. As the investigation continued, authorities searched the property where Norwood had lived until his stroke. It was a modest home in a quiet part of coastal Maine, unassuming in every way. The attic was empty, save for a few boxes of church newsletters, faded tax forms, and a locked drawer in his bedroom desk. When forced open, the drawer revealed nothing but old receipts, a Bible, and a yellowed envelope made elope in her vessel. Inside was the Mercy Ridge Hospital bill, the temporary guardianship document, and a crude drawing of a house with two stick figures, one labeled me and one labeled Uncle. There were no letters, no confession, no explanation. If Richard Norwood had kept journals, destroyed photos, or written down the truth, they were long gone. He had taken her, renamed her, and erased every bridge back to the life he stole. And now he was dead, 10 years gone, his grave marked by a modest stone, his legacy sealed behind silence and a carefully curated lie. Sarah visited the grave once. She didn't bring flowers. She stood there for a long time, the wind whipping her coat around her ankles, her hands clenched in her pockets. "Why?" she asked aloud, though no one could answer. She didn't cry, she felt nothing, and that disturbed her more than if she had felt rage. In the following weeks, she worked with a therapist to piece together the emotional dissonance, the simultaneous gratitude for the life she had, and grief for the one stolen from her. She wrestled with guilt for not remembering her parents sooner, for not questioning more. The therapist reminded her that trauma rewires the brain to survive, not to make sense. Her amnesia had been a defense, not a failure. In a symbolic act of reclamation, she legally petitioned to add Emily Gray as a second legal name, hyphenated, not to erase her life as Sarah Green, but to honor the girl she had once been. She told her son the full story, choosing honesty over protection, and he hugged her so tightly afterward she could hardly breathe. "Does this mean I get a cool mystery pass, too?" he asked, trying to lighten the mood. She smiled through her tears. "No, sweetheart. You get something better. You get the truth from the start." Meanwhile, Thomas, watching from a respectful distance, allowed himself for the first time in years to imagine a future that wasn't clouded by the unknown. He didn't expect Sarah to move in or to call him Dad overnight. He didn't need that. All he needed was what he now had, proof that she was alive, that he hadn't been wrong, and that love, even when stretched across decades and distance, could still find its way back through the fog. The invitation was written simply, without flourish or expectation. "Would you sit with me this Sunday? St. Clement's, 10 a.m. Thomas had penned it with trembling hands, uncertain if she would come, but needing to offer it anyway. He placed it in an envelope, added a pressed white flower from his backyard, something he used to tuck behind Emily's ear when she was little, and mailed it without checking for second thoughts. On Sunday morning he arrived early, as always. The church had changed little over the years. The church had been refinished, and the stained glass had been cleaned recently. But the bones of the place, the creaking of the old wood, the musty perfume of hymnal pages, the faint scent of beeswax candles, remained exactly as they had been the day his daughter disappeared. He sat in the same spot, third pew from the front, left side, eyes forward, hands resting on the hymn book he no longer needed to open. She arrived just as the bells finished tolling. No grand entrance, no hesitation. Sarah, now both Sarah and Emily, walked quietly down the side aisle in a soft gray coat, her hair tucked behind her ears, her posture calm but guarded. She looked around with subtle awe, her eyes absorbing the details like a visitor touring a distant country that should have felt like home. When she reached the pew, Thomas stood slowly. They didn't hug. Instead, she sat beside him and whispered, "Thank you for the invitation." He nodded. Neither of them spoke for a while. The service began, familiar songs, familiar scripture, but neither was listening. They were too aware of the moment, of the shared silence, of the miracle of presence after 40 years of absence. After communion, when most of the congregation had bowed their heads in prayer, Sarah leaned in. "This place is familiar," she said. "I didn't think it would be, but I remember the light." Thomas smiled gently. "You used to chase the colors from the window across the floor," he whispered. "You'd pretend they were fairy footsteps." She laughed, short and surprised. "I thought I made that up. I thought it was just a dream." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded photo, creased at the corners, the colors faded but still vivid in feeling. In the photo, a young Emily sat cross-legged in the playroom of their old house, cradling a stuffed giraffe with oversized button eyes and a crooked smile stitched across its face. "This," he said softly, "was yours. You named him Gobo." Sarah took the photo slowly, her eyes locking onto the giraffe. Her breath caught. Her hand trembled. "Gobo," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "I dreamed of him for years. I thought he was just—" She turned the photo over and read the date, August 1983, then pressed it gently to her chest. "I didn't imagine him. He was real. That's the last piece." Tears welled in her eyes, not from grief this time, but from something deeper, release. After the service, they remained in the pew as the church emptied. The soft murmur of departing parishioners faded into stillness. Thomas reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. "I don't know how to be your daughter," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "and I don't expect you to pretend none of this happened." He nodded. "I don't want to erase Sarah. I just want you to know Emily's always had a place here. Even when you didn't know it," she squeezed his hand. "Maybe we can start from now, not as strangers, not pretending it's all fixed, but as something new." He smiled through the ache in his chest. "I'd like that." They left the church together, walking slowly through the courtyard, where Emily used to chase birds and pick flowers from the cracks in the stone. The sun had broken through the clouds, casting long beams of golden light across the grounds, illuminating the ivy-covered walls and making the dust in the air look like magic. As they reached the gate, Sarah paused. "I'd like to come back here again. Maybe next time with my son." Thomas nodded. He'd like the window light too. In the months that followed, they met regularly, sometimes at the church, sometimes at parks or cafes, slowly weaving new threads into a relationship neither expected to reclaim. Sarah began keeping a dual journal, one side titled Sarah and the other Emily, allowing herself to speak freely from both selves without judgment. Her therapist called it integration. She called it peace. Thomas continued to send her photos, stories, and even a recipe for the blueberry muffins she once loved but no longer remembered. One day she baked them. They tasted like memory. There was no tidy conclusion, no sudden transformation. Sarah didn't recover every memory, and Thomas didn't get back the years he lost, but in the space they now shared, open, patient, imperfect, they found something better than certainty. Connection. A truth too long buried had finally been unearthed, not with dramatic confrontation or punishment, but through persistence, faith, and a father's refusal to let time have the final word. And as Sarah stood once more in front of the stained glass window at St. Clement's, watching the light dance across the floor, she smiled, not as a woman with a fractured past, but as someone finally whole, not because she had found her way back to the beginning. Before you go, let us know, what do you think really happened during those missing years? Which moment in the story struck you the most? And where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. There's more to uncover, and your support helps us keep telling the stories that deserve to be found.